So welcome everyone to the second day of our conference, marking 60 years since Nostra Aetate, the groundbreaking declaration of the Catholic Church on non-Christian religions, promulgated at the Second Vatican Council on October 28, 1965. My name is Yonatan Moss. I serve as head of this university's Department of Comparative Religion and director of this university's Center for the Study of Christianity, one of the co-sponsors and co-organizers of this event. It has been an honor and a pleasure to work with my two main partners in this conference, my dear colleague Karma Ben Yochanan, head of the ERC Project on Christo-Semitism, and my old friend Tzvi Novik of Notre Dame University. Although the initiative began as a three-way partnership, due to an accumulation of additional administrative burdens, I needed at a certain point to take a step back from my organizational capacities, and Karma and Tzvi kindly agreed to remain at the helm. So I thank you both for gracefully steering this ship to the harbor in the final stages of its journey. Thank you to the Tantur Ecumenical Institute, who hosted the wonderful first day of our conference. Thank you to the able administrators here at Tantur and at Notre Dame, who made all this possible. And thank you to all the participants and audience who have come from near and far to teach, to learn, and to discuss the history and afterlife of Nostra Aetate. I'd like to say a few words about the rationale of this conference and something about Hebrew University's Center for the Study of Christianity. As will become clear, these two themes are not unrelated. We chose to call this conference Nostra Aetate, in their age and in ours. This decision was motivated by an understanding that 60 years after the event, that is 2 to 3 generations onwards, different Catholics and different Jews reproduce at different rates, we are not in the same age as the fathers of the council were. This is not only because of the natural passage of time, but also because the world that we live in now is a very different world than that of 1965. In my capacity as greeter rather than presenter, I cannot enter into the differences, cultural, technological, geopolitical, and demographic. Suffice it to say, in general terms, that the Catholic Church is not where it was 60 years ago, both physically and spiritually, and Jews and Judaism are not where they were 60 years ago, both physically and spiritually. The reputations on the world stage of both the Catholic Church and the Jewish state were very different back then than they are now. These differences are all things that cannot be ignored as we compare the council and its effect in their age and in ours. Although a mere greeter, I beg your indulgence for two little observations I wish to offer to you about the actual text of the Nostra Aetate declaration that has brought us here today. My first observation has to do with what I was just talking about. The aitas, or age, or era, that Nostra Aetate refers to. I mentioned that their age is different from ours. How, one might ask, did the framers of Nostra Aetate themselves conceive of their age? Given that these are the opening words of the document, we need to do no more than read its first sentence to discover what its formulators thought of as the essence of their age. I quote, "In our age, when day by day mankind is being drawn closer together and the ties between different peoples are becoming stronger, the Church examines more closely her relationship to non-Christian religions." 60 years later, can we say the same of our age? I think few people would define our current time as one in which, quote, "day by day mankind is being drawn closer together and the ties between different peoples are becoming stronger." The question then becomes, In the face of the discrepancy between the ages, what does the Catholic Church do now? Does it carry that vision of fraternal connection from that age into ours? Or does it adapt itself once again, this time to the new winds of our current age of polarization? Midway between the Second Vatican Council and today, that is about 30 years ago, I'm not sure if that was more Nostra Aetate's age or more ours, a brave and visionary Catholic Belgian-German couple, Hubert and Aldegonde Brenninkmeijer-Verhaan, took action to implement one of Nostra Aetate's main practical recommendations. Among other things, Nostra Aetate paragraph section 4 states, "This sacred synod wants to foster and recommend the mutual understanding and respect which is the fruit, above all, of biblical and theological studies." Inspired by these words, the Brenninkmeijer-Verhaans founded 2 academic centers at 2 different universities. The Cardinal Bea Center for Judaic Studies at the Gregorian Pontifical University in Rome, and I'm very happy to have the center's current director, Massimo Gargiulio, with us here, and the Bea Center has also participated in the funding of this conference. That was one center. And the Center for the Study of Christianity at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. The mandate in both cases was and is purely academic. Jewish and Christian professors at both centers research and teach the history, theology, and sociology of the minority tradition of the respective cities, Judaism in Rome, Christianity in Jerusalem. The goal stems from the governing principle of Nostra Aetate's age, which is, as pointed out above, no longer maybe that self-evident in our current age. The strengthening of ties between different peoples made possible through mutual understanding and respect, which are the fruit of study and research. I'm happy to acknowledge the presence of Mrs. Aldegonde Brenninkmeijer-Verhaan, who has joined us for this second day of our conference. Thank you, Aldegonde, to you and to your late husband, Hubert, for your vision and your action then and now. The work that you make possible at these 2 centers you have founded does not just fulfill the vision of the Second Vatican Council, but, if I may say so and may argue, it also fulfills the most oft repeated commandment in the Torah, to love the ger. The ger in our age, I would say, is best translated as the minority who lives among us. Love the ger, the minorities living among you, the Torah tells the Israelites 4 times, for you were gerim, a minority in the land of Egypt. The fostering of love and understanding of the other, particularly the minority, is accomplished in an academic setting through the honest, yet non-judgmental study of their tradition, their history, their beliefs, and their practices. We have seen some wonderful examples of this yesterday, and I trust we will see many more today. And this brings me to my final remark, another little observation about the text of Nostra Aetate. It is actually more of a question than a remark, and perhaps the experts in the room, I am not an expert, can help answer it. It is a question that arises especially from our study of Nostra Aetate here in Jerusalem, the holy city of 3 faiths, and in the context of our very current times of unimaginable violence inflicted by members of these 3 faiths upon each other, one another. It is the 4th section of Nostra Aetate that famously addresses Jews and Judaism. The section right before that is dedicated to Muslims and Islam. Reading these sections one after the other, as one normally would, raises a question. Section 3 concludes with these words, I quote, "Since in the course of centuries, not a few quarrels and hostilities have arisen between Christians and Muslims, this sacred synod urges all to forget the past and to work sincerely for mutual understanding, and to preserve as well as to promote together, for the benefit of all mankind, social justice and moral welfare, as well as peace and freedom. Section 4 then opens with the following words: as the Sacred Synod searches into the mystery of the Church, it remembers the bond that spiritually ties the people of the New Covenant to Abraham's stock. What a contrast. When it comes to Muslims, everyone is urged to forget the past. But with Jews, the Church remembers. That is the only time the word remembrance or memory is used in the document. Twice more, we are told that the Church cannot forget aspects of its Jewish roots. And these are the only 3 times the verb forgetting is used in the document. Once to command everyone to forget Christian-Muslim hostility, and twice not to forget the Jewish background of Christianity. There was no other forgetting or not forgetting in Nostra Aetate. Why? Looking at this from the perspective of a historian of Jewish-Christian relations, this seems strange to me. If the Church seeks to achieve with Muslims the same mutual understanding it seeks with Jews, would it not do well to remember and study their shared history of mutual violence so as to learn the lessons from it that will prevent its repetition in the present and in the future? Willful amnesia, even of unpleasant memories, is a disturbing thing, not just to the historian, but it would seem to anyone seeking to implement the worthy ideals of the age of Nostra Aetate. It is with this question, relevant both to the text of Nostra Aetate and I think to our current reality, that I leave you as greeter before I transform into the chair of our first session. But first, I invite Rabbi Mark Dratch of the International Jewish Committee for Religious Consultations to offer his words of welcome. I wish us all a very productive second day of learning.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to share a few words and feelings with you on this second day. My name is Mark Dratch. I am, as was mentioned, the current chair of IJCIC, IJCIC, the International Jewish Committee for Interreligious Consultations. That was my criteria for being the chair. I know what the acronym stands for, and I can share it with you. IJCIC was founded in 1970, following Nostra Aetate, when the Church offered an invitation to speak with Jews. As our mythical memory goes, 100 Jewish organizations came pounding on the door of the Vatican. We're Jews, please speak with us. The Vatican said, we can't speak to everyone, please organize yourselves, create one group, and that group will be our official dialogue partner. So a modern miracle of the Catholic Church is that Jews from across the religious and communal spectrum actually have been working together in one organization since 1970, representing the Jewish community, first to the Vatican and subsequently also to the World Evangelical Alliance, the World Council of Churches, the Eastern Patriarchate, and we are beginning to dabble in the world of Islam as well, and that's created some interesting challenges and opportunities. It's not a natural fit for me to be involved in this. I am a student of Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik of blessed memory, whose photograph is not here. Right? Abraham Joshua Heschel is here because Heschel embraced Vatican II and Nostra Aetate and the opportunity for Jews and Catholics to sit together and be in dialogue. Rabbi Soloveitchik was very, very skeptical, and he very, very, very reluctantly, and I'm preaching to the choir here, you're probably all familiar, very reluctantly agreed to dialogue with many, many caveats. No theology, no really sharing. He was afraid of syncretism. He was afraid of movement to try to force compromise on religious values or theology or practice. And he kind of went along with those kinds of things. My sense is that amongst many other things, he was very suspicious of the church. If the church could not succeed in 2,000 years to attract Jews to believe through the sword, well, maybe with a little bit of honey. As a student of Rabbi Soloveitchik, who amongst many things encouraged independent thought, I disagree with him. I think that the past 60 years of Nostra Aetate has proven that there was a major transformation in the church, and the opportunity for us to speak with each other, to learn how to respect each other, to learn from each other, has really, despite challenges over the 60 years and despite the challenges of the past couple of years, has really shown that we're living in a different age. And because I was a pulpit rabbi for many years who no longer has a pulpit, please indulge me for the next 2 minutes to share two texts with you. The first is a text from the Talmud that actually speaks about an event that took place here on Mount Scopus following the year 70, following the destruction of the temple. Temple Mount is not far from here. And the Talmud tells the story of 5 great rabbis of the time, Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Yehoshua, and Rabbi Akiva, who came to the top of Mount Scopus. And when they saw the Temple Mount the temple in destruction, they tore their clothes, a traditional act of mourning and of sadness. When they reached Mount Scopus, they tore their clothes. When they came to the Temple Mount, they saw a fox running out of the ruined building of the Holy of Holies. They began to weep, and Rabbi Akiva laughed. They said to him, "Akiva, you always astonish us. We are weeping, and yet you laugh." He replied, "Why are you weeping?" They said to him, "Should we not weep when a fox emerges from the place of which it is written in the book of Numbers, and the commoner that encroaches shall be put to death?" This is indeed how the verse, "Because of this our hearts are sick, because of these our eyes are dimmed, because of Mount Zion which lies desolate, foxes prowl over it." The book of Lamentations. This verse has been fulfilled for us. Rabbi Akiva said to them, "This is precisely why I laughed. For it is also said," the book of Isaiah, and call reliable witnesses, Uriah the priest and Zachariah the son of Yevarech. This is written in English letters, so I don't understand how to, the Hebrew will be much better. To witness for us. Now, what is the connection between Uriah and Zachariah? Uriah said, "Zion shall be plowed as a field, Jerusalem shall become heaps of ruin, and the Temple Mount a shrine of woods." And what did Zachariah say? "Thus said the Lord of hosts, there shall yet be old men and women in the squares of Jerusalem." Said God, "These are my 2 witnesses. If the words of Uriah are fulfilled, so will the words of Zachariah be annulled. I rejoice that the words of Uriah have been fulfilled, because that means that in the end, the words of Zachariah shall be fulfilled as well." They said to him, "Akiva, you have comforted us." 2 different prophecies, one of destruction and one of redemption. If the prophecy of destruction could be fulfilled, then people of faith have faith that the prophecy of redemption can be fulfilled as well. And in a sense, that's what I see here. For 2,000 years, the relations between Catholics and Jews have, to a large degree, been that of the former. And yet, for the past 60 years, we're beginning to see the fulfillment of the second prophecy, of respect, of peace, of a coming together, of a mutuality, of a brotherhood and a sisterhood between people who had been estranged. And that gives people of faith in the future that things can be and will be different. And that's what I found so encouraging from the presentations yesterday, and look forward to hearing from the presentations today as well. One other quick idea. How do we do this? So there is a practice, and when Jews pray, we end many of our prayers with the invocation of the words, "Oseh Shalom Bimromav," God who created peace in the heavens, may he create peace for us here on earth. Somehow it's a lot easier to have the planets and the solar systems and the galaxies remain in their place than it is for people on earth to kind of live as neighbors and get along with each other. But one of the choreography of the synagogue, when this is recited at the end of 2 major prayers, we take 3 steps back, and we bow to our left, and we bow to our right. The real explanation is probably in prayer, we stand before the king. When we take leave of the king, we don't just turn our backs and walk away, but we take a few steps back and we show homage by bowing. A colleague of mine once said, there's something else here, that in this choreography, there is an important lesson for how to create peace. And that is that if you want to create peace between people, between peoples, between nations, you can't stand your ground and insist that you're always right and that things have to be exactly the way you see them. If you want to create peace, take 3 steps back. And then look at the situation from this perspective. And then turn and look at the situation from this perspective. And then maybe there's a chance for peace. Maybe he who created peace in heavens can create peace for us here on earth as well. The presentations here and the work that so many of you are involved in have given us that opportunity to take a few steps back and to look at the situation from this perspective and from that perspective. And maybe, God willing, since the first prophecy has already been fulfilled, maybe through our work, through your work, through taking those steps and gaining those perspectives, we can begin to fulfill the second prophecy as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So now we move on to our first session of the day. I'm pleased to, just a word about the framework of the structure. We will have half an hour presentations. If you want, you can leave a little time for questions after your presentation if you speak less than half an hour. If you fill the full half an hour, that's fine, because there should be ample time at the end for questions. So our first presenter is Dr. Sara Hahn, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the Freie Universität in Berlin, who works on research of anti-Semitism in the 21st century. Her dissertation, completed at the Selma Stern Center for Jewish Studies in Berlin-Brandenburg, is entitled Ernst Ludwig Ehrlich-Jüdisch-Christlicher Dialog als Lebensaufgabe, and it was published by Kohlhammer in 2024. Her work focuses on post-Shoah Jewish-Christian relations, theological anti-Semitism, and European Jewish history. Sara will be speaking to us about double displacement, Nostra Aetate, and the reality of Christian anti-Semitism, a German perspective. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for the warm welcome and for the opportunity to speak here. At this conference, among so many excellent scholars, my thanks goes to Karma, Sui, and Yonatan for making this possible. At the same time, I would like to ask all of you for your understanding in advance. As the subtitle, A German Perspective, already suggests, I'm speaking precisely that point this morning, and this applies not only to the way I read Nostra Aetate, but also to my presentation in English, which carries the accident of that perspective. So, it's a bit farther. Okay. A double.
This closer to you?
Yeah. Okay. So, he's a short person. A double displacement, Nostra Aetate, and the reality of Christian anti-Semitism, a German perspective introduction. One looks at the history of Christianity, which is concurrently a history of hostility toward Jews. One can hardly deny that much has changed since Nostra Aetate, and some of it for the better. Mysterium Ecclesiae, the first section of the Declaration, marked a theological turning point on the Catholic Church's relationship to Judaism, grounded in the insight that Church cannot understand itself apart from the chosen people, Israel. The Council rejected the long-standing claim that Judaism had lost its legitimacy post-Christum, a claim that stands in direct contradiction to the witness of Scripture. Cardinal Bea therefore emphasized that the purpose of the declaration was, quote, to follow with utmost fidelity our Lord Christ himself and the apostles Peter and Paul, end of quote. The church relation to the Jewish people thus became a constitutive element of its renewal, yet this reflection did not arise from an inner theological development, but from external impulses after the Shoah. After the collapse of all moral and theological certainties, only a few individuals dared to lay the groundwork for a new encounter between Jews and Christians. Nostra Aetate is often told as a success story, a story of reconciliation, openness, and renewal. And many described it as a paradigmatic or even Copernican turn. Others have critically questioned this narrative and analyzed which theological changes have and have not been translated into practice. In my paper, I seek to show that 60 years after Nostra Aetate, the narrative of a turning point contains elements of self-exoneration. I will trace how a double displacement, the relegation of theological anti-Judaism to the past, and the externalization of anti-Semitism as a secular phenomenon, was already operative during the Council and continued thereafter. I illustrate this through the observation and interventions of Ernst Ludwig Ehrlich, who was a Jewish partner and analyzed the ambivalences of the Council. So the following is divided into 3 parts. First, Ernst Ludwig Ehrlich and the reality of anti-Judaism during the Council. Second, between scripture and substitution. And third, the unfinished turn. Ernst Ludwig Ehrlich and the reality of anti-Judaism during the Council. Ernst Ludwig Ehrlich, born in 1921 in Berlin, shaped by the Hochschule für die Wissenschaft des Judentums, survived the Nazi period by going into hiding in Berlin and eventually fleeing to Switzerland in 1942. As one of Leo Baeck's last students, he participated as early as 1946 in the first efforts to establish Jewish-Christian dialogue after the Shoah, an endeavor that would accompany him throughout his life. Ehrlich developed a keen sensitivity to ambivalences and the potentials of emerging dialogue, and became one of its most important figures in the German-speaking world. During the Council, the Vatican Council, as the director of the European District of B'nai B'rith, Ehrlich was not a mere observer, but a critical partner. At the same time, he was actually aware that the Council was a Catholic event, a process taking place within and for the Church, by which its relationship, Ecclesia Habitude, to Judaism and to Jews was defined for all its members. Ehrlich's observation revealed that the debates about the so-called Judenerklärung were shaped by anti-Semitic undertones, not only at the margins, but at the very center of the Council. Although renewal, signs of the times, and aggiornamento were invoked, all patterns of rejection persisted. One example is the temporary removal of the planned Decretum de Judaeis in 1962, which was officially justified by the so-called Goldman-Wadi affair and by concerns of Christians in the Middle East. Cardinal Cicognani, the Vatican Secretary of the State and head of the Council Coordinating Committee, stated that the Church wished, quote, to take sides with neither party. He had also claimed that the recalling the Church connections to Israel was unnecessary, since the Jews, quote, knew they were welcome if they wished to embrace the Catholic faith, end of quote. This echoed the Church enduring missionary stance from the First Vatican Council. Ehrlich identified early on that the anti-Jewish positions during the Council were only, quote, partly attributable to the Arab League. The rest was original, a Catholic product, end of quote. The Coetus Internationalis Patrum, the group around Archbishop Lefebvre, Bishop Kali, and the Cardinals Felici, Siri, and Ruffini, defended anti-Jewish theological positions under the rhetoric of preserving tradition. In doing so, they assert anti-Judaism as a binding tradition of Catholicism. It becomes evident that the defense of Catholic identity that was presented in fact served to perpetuate entrenched anti-Jewish patterns. Notwithstanding the fact that these constituted minority voices and there were actually influences is difficult to measure, the entire textual history illustrates how challenging it was for the Church to formulate a Declaratio de Judaeis at all. However, the commonly used scholarly phrase, anti-Semitism at the margins of the Council, already contains a strategy of displacement. It creates the impression that the issue is only of secondary importance, even though these margins are still part of the Church. The type of language shifts our attention away from the center and downplays the needs for the theological reflection on the entanglement of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism within Catholicism. At the same time, it reinforces the notion that anti-Semitism is merely political or a social phenomenon. How else, if not anti-Semitism, can one describe the statements made by the Apostolic Vicar of Tripoli, who rejected the drafting of the declaration as a product of, quote, international Zionism, and claimed that Jews are provoked in a conscientious, proud, arrogant, and avaricious manner? Or the remark of Cardinal Gigognani, who argued that the Church, quote, cannot oppose the entire Arab world just to satisfy the Jews who attached importance to this declaration, not for religious, but for other reasons. Or the words of Victor Alain Barthol, Lefebvre's theological advisor, who wrote to Bishop Carli that, quote, the Jews are so clever that they have succeeded in dividing Christians in the opinion they hold of them. The examples show that the rejection of a declaration on Jews was consciously linked to anti-Semitic conspiracy tropes. To describe these positions as merely marginal is a trivialization. It is a part of a broader process of displacement. The Church could emphasize its reaction of theological anti-Judaism while at the same time relegating anti-Semitism first to the margins and then entirely outside itself, beyond its own responsibility. This maintained silence about the Church historical and theological entanglements reinforced the notion of a clear separation between anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism and created the conditions for the afterlife, das Nachleben of anti-Semitism within Church and Church motives. Second, between scripture and substitution. Ehrlich's most important intervention concerns scripture itself. In 1964, he sharply criticized the revised draft of the declaration, calling it an exegetical embarrassment. He argued that the text distorted Romans 11:25. The theocentric focus of the chapter was displaced in favor of an exclusive Christological reading, creating space for interpretation tending towards the mission of contemporary Jews. I truly cannot understand how anyone can claim to be quoting Paul here, he wrote to John Österreicher. It is important to point out that Ehrlich did not object to the idea that a Catholic text might express a Christian eschatological hope, one that could in some sense also include Jewish people. But his concern centered on the distortion of the Pauline text. By altering a structure, the draft no longer stood on the foundation of the New Testament, as he wrote, a fact obvious to anyone capable of reading it, the New Testament. So if the issue were not corrected immediately, the council would make itself look ridiculous before the entire world. He wrote, Ehrlich's critique exposes a key mechanism of Christian anti-Judaism. Scripture itself is used as a theological instrument to reject the Jews and serve to uphold the church's claim to truth, at the expense of the Jewish people, a displacement of Scripture in favor of a doctrine of replacement. Third, the unfinished turn. The real turn of Nostra Aetate consisted not in creating a new theology, but in overcoming the centuries-long negation of Israel. The declaration marks the beginning of a hermeneutical self-examination and remains a key text of understanding the council's tension between continuity and renewal. Despite the frequently emphasized character of Nostra Aetate as a compromise text, the document articulates the grammar of an Israel theology, in which the Jewish elements is constitutive for Catholic self-reflection. Yet, the fact that this theology still had to be taught through and articulated belongs itself to the long history of Christian anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. Neither was an isolated incident born of ignorance, but rather a systematic pattern that surfaced whenever the Church denied its bond with Judaism in order to reaffirm its own claim as the sole people of God. The reality was visible during the Council and extended far beyond it. The intention here is not to dismiss Nostra Aetate as a theological turning point, nor to downplay the work of Cardinal Bea, John Österreicher, Gregory Baum, and the members of the Secretary for Promoting Christian Unity. It is thanks to their tireless efforts that the declaration did not vanish into the Vatican archives, but was at long last presented for the promulgation 60 years ago. Yet, 60 years on from Nostra Aetate, the Church still struggles to acknowledge and address anti-Semitism within its own ranks. Incidents are often called as misunderstandings or isolated cases, as if they only occur at the church margins or beyond its boundaries. And indeed, this is where we find the traditionalist Society of St. Pius X, which has been in open separation from the Church since Council. But the persistence of anti-Semitism is a symptom of a deeper structural issues. Current religious textbooks in Germany, assertions about Israel deficient covenant, and survey data on supposed Jewish responsibility for the crucifixion all indicate that anti-Jewish pattern persist. Their conceptual force has hardly diminished. The resistance among Christian and political right-wing milieu to Israel theological reorientation shows how theological anti-Judaism functions as a theological hinge between religious and far-right movements that invoke a Christian national identity and portray religious plurality as a threat. This remains an unfinished task of Nostra Aetate, to confront the afterlife of anti-Semitism, both its enduring presence and its changing forms within the Church. And this is precisely what Ernst Ludwig Ehrlich taught. Those who deny anti-Semitism within the Church and relegated theological anti-Judaism to the past fail to recognize what Nostra Aetate demands: a reflection on the Church identity free of substitutionary logic and self-exoneration narratives. Because the theological reception of Nostra Aetate must be consciously retaught for, as the opening words remind us, in our time. although important studies have appeared, although churches and Jewish-Christian dialogue initiatives in both German states and then later in the reunified Federal Republic played a central role in shaping culture of remembrance and deepening awareness of Christians' Jewish roots, the actualization of Nostra Aetate remains fragile. Recognition often remains merely symbolic. And yet, the narrative of its success continued to reprocess itself, a narrative that serves the church's self-exoneration. Anti-Judaism is regarded as having been overcome and safely consigned to the past, while anti-Semitism is externalized as a secular phenomenon. The dynamics stabilize an ecclesial self-image that celebrates the achievements of Nostra Aetate and presents the church as a reliable partner in combating anti-Semitism, even as classical anti-Jewish patterns in liturgy, preaching, and education continue to endure. Thus, neither anti-Semitism within the church nor the structure of theological anti-Judaism is then, to put it plainly, considered relevant for contemporary theological reflection. The question posed by Jean-Marie in 1976 at the Woche der Brüderlichkeiten, where are the brothers, has since October the 7th received no answer from Rome. Conclusion. Ehrlich hoped that the promulgation of Nostra Aetate would place Jewish Catholic dialogue on a firm foundation and open a new common path. Yet Ehrlich was by no means naive. He warned that the text would remain a dead letter unless Christians made it their own and translated it into action. 60 years later, his warning remains. The turn of Nostra Aetate is unfinished, and the double displacement persists. And the task poses to rethink Catholic self-understanding in the light of its bond with Judaism remains as urgent as ever. Allow me to conclude with the word of Ernst Ludwig Ehrlich, who passed away in October 2007 in Switzerland, and for whom Jewish-Christian dialogue became a lifelong task. However, as early as 1975, Ehrlich made a sobering observation. The root does not at present seem interesting enough to be taken into account in the many varieties of theological thinking. To be honest, for Christian, it has been so only rarely. After 1945, out of a sense of guilt, and in connection with that, also during and after the Council. There was a relatively brief flicker of intention, and Jews and Judaism were granted a short, polite bow.
Thank you very much, Sara, for this thought-provoking lecture. I think we have time for a couple questions before we move on to the next lecture. So the floor is open. Yes. Sara.
Hi, Sara.
Hi.
Here, Sara, you can come back here.
Oh, okay. Is this my water?
Yeah, that's your water.
Yeah.
In your paper, you speak about Jews and Judaism interchangeably, what I see. And when Nostra Aetate has a different approach to Jews, it doesn't really mention Judaism, right? So maybe it's overreading the Nostra Aetate to say that it has changed their approach to Judaism. Judaism is still different religion, the wrong religion, so forth. But approach to Jews has changed. So maybe anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism are really two different phenomena, and there should be read into like that Nostra Aetate has to change its attitude towards Judaism just because it changed its attitude towards Jews.
So, yeah, when I understand your question right, to be more precisely in the wording of Jews and Judaism. For sure, you're absolutely right. And to go further on, Nostra Aetate even don't call Israel as a name. It calls, I don't know in English, seed, yeah, Stamm of Abraham. Yeah. So that's absolutely right, but I think so, coming from a German perspective and seeing Jewish-Christian dialogue after the Shoah, to be more correct here, after the 60s, we can't divide Jews and Judaism, and to be more precisely, in German, we wouldn't say the Jews and the Judaism as we would say in the plural form. So, in my paper, for sure, it's not that clear, but in German, I would use the plural form, because then you also see the renewal. I don't know if this now is the right word in English, but the renewal in interaction from the church, from the Roman Catholic Church, to the several denominations of Judaism. And so I think from this perspective of thinking from theological concepts, you can't take them both off.
You can separate them.
Yeah, separate them. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Well, why not?
I need to open to others as
Yeah,
well.
okay.
Maybe one more question?
I will inherit.
Supersede.
Yes. Thank you, Sara. I was wondering if you can say more. I mean, do you think that there is no difference at all between anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism? And do you think that the Jewish participants or readers of the council thought so? I'm asking because also I have interest in this question, in the genealogy of this question. And also because it's not only the Catholic discourse that makes this distinction, it's also anti-Semitism scholarship that many Jewish scholars are also taking part in this. So I'm wondering, do you think this is always an abusive statement to say that these are two different things, or it also has its historical validity?
Of course, and of course, Of course, and I don't want to skip anti-Judaism as a term and put everything under the term of anti-Semitism. But I think we should use them as umbrella terms and go more precisely on the adjectives. And for my argument, I can hardly separate anti-Judaism, so Christian anti-Judaism and Christian anti-Semitism, as I just tried to show from this little quotes. And also, when you look in Lexikon für Theologie und Kirche, so the lexicon of theology and the church, you have on 1907 the first term of anti-Semitism, and 1930 the second one, revised from Grundlach. And he stretched this more, and he said we have anti-Semitism as an unchristian form, and this is the racial and the folkish and everything, but we have a Christian anti-Semitism, and this is the good one. And I think from this point on, we can't really, so we need to look at several sections, but what the purpose was to get them so separately from each other that it won't be your interest. You can say, okay, and I think the both go together, the theologian as well as the anti-Semitism research scholars. They won't take anti-Semitism as a religious forms. But then how can you explain then, let's say on COVID time, that we have the blood libel, Ritualmord lies again. It's one-to-one the same what we had in the 15th century. So without religious terms and without a religious signature in it, even though their speakers are secular or atheists, it's still involved in it. So I don't think we are doing well, so for the German perspective, to separate those terms in researching anti-Semitism. And going back to the inner church discussion, it doesn't bring good for so-called Aufarbeitung from the church side. Yeah.
I'm sure there are more questions, but we'll have time for them at the end of our 3 papers. Thank you again, Sara. We now move on to Daniel Herskowitz. Daniel Herskowitz is the Smart Family Associate Professor at the Department of Religious Studies at Duke University. His first book, Heidegger and His Jewish Reception, Cambridge University Press 2021, was awarded the Salo Baron Young Scholars Award for Scholarly Excellence. His second book, The Judeo-Christian Thought of Franz Rosenzweig, is forthcoming with Oxford University Press. His current research project is on the Jews and the Second Vatican Council. Daniel will speak to us about a staff not broken, dignity and humiliation in the Jewish reactions to the Council.
Good morning. I want to begin by thanking the organizers for this truly wonderful conference. Yesterday was thought-provoking and set a very high of nuance, interest, and depth, and I hope we managed to clear that bar again today. I am going to be talking about dignity and humiliation in Jewish responses to the Second Vatican Council. The drafting of the document that will soon be known as Nostra Aetate was a prolonged process combining intellectual inspiration, theological debate, and also political pressure. Commonly, when we think about Jewish responses to the Church's attempt to rethink its approach towards Judaism and Jews, in Vatican II, we focus on ideas, on religious ideas, on doctrines, on traditions. But there is an additional and equally crucial dimension to this response, and that is the emotive dimension that relates to emotions. And what I want to suggest today is that time and again, alongside religious arguments, were emotive considerations that related to the theme of Jewish pride, dignity, humiliation, and shame. Now, there has been a lot of work on the role of emotions in history, in historical, political, and cultural processes. And I suggest that much can be benefited from approaching Jewish-Christian relations in general and Jewish attitudes towards Vatican II in particular through this perspective. Now, historically, for centuries, in both Jewish and Christian eyes, Judaism was a degraded religion, hadat hamushpelet, so the religion cast down. For Christians, this was a theological statement. For Jews, it was a political, historical one. And the figures of the triumphant ecclesia versus the blindfolded synagoga that adorned cathedrals around Europe publicly displayed Judaism's subjugated status. And in response, Jews developed different strategies to shield and preserve their own sense of dignity and self-respect. Now, this emotive aspect is central to the history of Jewish-Christian relations and to the way in which it was memorialized and narrated. And what I want to say today is that it is also crucial to understanding the Jewish responses to Vatican II. Now, before I begin, a methodological note. In my analysis, I am going to follow those scholars who speak of nexuses or families or economies of emotions. And by this I mean a number of discrete emotions that are dynamically codependent and that are separate but still operate under a larger framework. And in this context, I'm going to be talking about the nexus of dignity, respect, honor, shame, humiliation. Now, parsing out the distinctions between these emotions is very tricky, but they all relate to the question of worth and value that is either present or lacking, or granted or denied in an individual and a collective. And of course, the complication increases when we consider the fact that the word in Hebrew, kavod, encompasses all the connotations of dignity, respect, honor, even glory. I am also basing my argument on scholars that show that collectives can experience and could also be motivated to action by collective emotions. And here I have Barbara Rosenzwein's work on what she calls emotional community. So in other words, I'm not going to be referring to any passionate response or emotional outbursts by any specific individuals that were involved in the council, but rather I will argue that for many Jews, the council brought to the fore the deep historical memory and also enduring presence of this emotive pride, humiliation nexus in relation to Christianity, and that Jewish responses to the council were often thought of and interpreted and expressed through these emotional paradigms. From the very beginning, the topic of Jewish-Christian relations in the council was framed and colored by this emotive context of pride and dignity. It's not a coincidence that the work that played a role in prompting Pope John to include the topic of the Jews on the council agenda was Jules Isaacs' teaching of contempt, where he urges Christianity to replace these teachings of contempt with teachings of respect towards Jews. And nor is it irrelevant that the clashes within the Jewish world over the appropriate involvement and cooperation with the council, of course, made use of textual sources and halacha categories and also historical memory, but emotionally charged questions loomed large in the background. Would working with the council on these matters constitute dignified behavior rooted in self-respect, or will this involvement be destined to merely repeat the humiliating and unequal power dynamic of Jews and Christians of the past? Now, there are many examples for this, and this paper is a condensed version of an extended article on this. And here I want to mention three examples in relative brevity, one about Abraham Joshua Heschel, one about Soloveitchik, and one about Pope Paul's pilgrimage to the Holy Land, to Jordan and Israel. So one of the leading figures involved with the council was Abraham Joshua Heschel, and in many letters and reports, he makes very clear that when interacting with Rome, he felt very acutely that he was not representing himself, but rather representing Judaism as such. And therefore, he felt that he was entrusted to preserve the dignity of the Jewish people as a whole. And he repeatedly emphasizes that his hope and his plea that the church would recognize what he calls the integrity and permanent preciousness of Jews and Judaism, and that Jews and Judaism have dignity in the present, not as a relic of the past, but as the driving force of contemporary Jewish existence. Now, this issue of Jewish dignity and representing Judaism to Christianity was very central to Heschel, but it cuts both ways. And in the beginning of the third session of the council, Heschel was received by Pope Paul for an audience, which was a disaster. Heschel was so anxious and so unfocused that at a certain point, Zachariah Schuster, who was another Jewish representative who accompanied Heschel to this audience, Schuster interrupted the conversation and began speaking in French, a language he knew the Pope knew, but Heschel did not, hoping to remedy this situation. Now, later, Schuster explained his unorthodox and honestly humiliating intervention by stating that what took place in the audience was the humiliation of Judaism in the face of the head of the Catholic Church. So while the Pope was respectful and dignified, Schuster writes in this report, Heschel used what he calls a whining, pleading tone and a low level of appeal, and that this pleading was basically placed Judaism and in this debased position in front of Christianity. And the whole episode was, in Schuster's words, lacking in self-dignity. The audience was supposed to be kept secret. That was the condition for it to happen in the first place. But when the story broke, the story of its occurrence broke, the whole shift to French was not yet published, a media frenzy ensued. And especially in the Jewish press, questions of honor, dignity, and humiliation were highlighted. So whether this story was presented as the struggle for Jewish dignity and respect, or it was presented as a disgraceful repetition of Jewish self-degradation, that depended on what the specific newspaper's attitude towards interfaith dialogue was. So Heschel was depicted either as the proud and determined rabbi advocating for the legitimacy of Judaism, or the humiliated Jewish leader who, as a suppliant, prostrates in front of a powerful pope. So, for example, the Orthodox organization National Council of Young Israel, which is very critical of Heschel, spoke about the distaste in lay leaders paying homage to the Pope, and this is talking about lay leaders, American Jewish leadership. How much more is it degrading to have spiritual leaders, i.e. Heschel, lowering themselves to beg? Now, when further details about this audience came out, like the whole episode of shifting to French, it again was discussed in the media in terms of pride and humiliation. And in one article that was published here in Israel, a contrast was set up between Heschel, the proud rabbi, and Schuster, the assimilated Jew lacking self-dignity. So what was recently come out, the article goes, are most important facts, especially regarding the position of Dr. Heschel and his demands, which were filled with Jewish glory and pride, right? Hadar u'ge'ava Yehudit. He preserved the honor of Israel, Kvod Israel, and elevated it in the most remarkable way, in contrast to all the servility and unbecoming deference, and this is hitrapsut v'hachna'a, and undignified publicity games of unworthy, ignorant Jewish representatives who acted noisily and without responsibility and self-respect, right? Without kavod atzmi. And the article concludes with the following assessment. From all this emerges the profound gulf between publicity seekers, cut off of their sources, and the man of the sources, the stature of Dr. Heschel, who in his words, and even in his very presence, represented values without concession and without submission, right? Lelo vitur velelo hachna'a. His meeting with the Pope, despite Schuster's intervention, proved that a man such as he would neither bow nor prostrate himself, right? So clear, very strong terms of pride and humiliation. Now, of course, the final words here are an allusion to the biblical figure Mordechai, who did not bow or prostrate himself in front of Haman, the enemy of the Jewish people in the book of Esther. And this allusion to Mordechai is, again, neither coincidence nor trivial. Mordechai embodies this typology of the court Jew, or the shtadlan, that is the Jewish petitioner in front of non-Jewish authorities who that resonates, this notion, this typology of the shtadlan resonates throughout the Jewish involvement in the council in general, and repeats itself in responses to this audience in particular. And it has this inherent ambiguity, the court Jew, especially when approached through the lens of pride and humiliation. So on the one hand, the court Jew is in this position that holds special access to power and opportunity to influence decision-making. On the other hand, it is a precarious role which is contingent on the ruler's decision and favor. So is the court Jew, or the Jew who is involved with the council, a figure of pride who stands up for the Jewish community, or is this a reflection of the humiliated and dependent status of Jews that we're familiar with from the past? Now, if Heschel saw the activity with the Vatican as touching on the affirmation of Jewish pride and dignity, Rabbi Joseph Dov Soloveitchik, the leader of modern Orthodoxy in America, rejected it on similar grounds. Now, Soloveitchik's negative attitude towards Jewish-Christian interfaith dialogue has received a lot of scholarly attention, but his frequent evocation of Jewish dignity and humiliation in support of his position is rarely discussed. And repeatedly, he rejects the attitude of some Jewish leaders, which he saw as, quote, extremely apologetic, bordering on servility. These attitudes give a problematic impression of helplessness and lack of self-reliance. And in one of his letters in the archive, he says, "Let no church dignitary be led to believe that our destiny and future are dependent upon his goodwill." And in fact, Soloveitchik himself renounces Heschel's audience with the Pope because of lack of dignity. And he writes, "The situation does not call for hysteria and readiness to incur martyrdom." And this is again a critical slide towards Heschel, who said he'd rather go to Auschwitz than convert if presented with those two alternatives. So Soloveitchik is saying this is hysteria. All it requires is common sense, responsibility, dignity, and particularly a moratorium on theological dialogue and pilgrimages to the Pope. And of course, pilgrimage to the Pope is precisely the slide against the audience. And in Soloveitchik's most influential statement on Jewish-Christian dialogues, in his 1964 essay Confrontation, he repeats again and again that any Jewish willingness to compromise with Christianity is, and he writes, indicative of a feeling of insecurity and inner emptiness. We cannot command the respect of our confronters by displaying a servile attitude. And he continues again with dignity. Only a candid, frank, and unequivocal policy reflecting unconditional commitment to our God, a sense of dignity, pride, and inner joy in being who we are, only this will lead to the practical benefits and will impress the peers of the faith community. Now, there's a lot more to say about this essay, but in the present context, what is important is that Soloveitchik does not base his rejection of interfaith dialogue with Christianity only on conceptual, theological, philosophical reasoning, but also he uses this emotive justification of Jewish pride and dignity. Jewish engagement with the Vatican reflected a submission to the church and a desire for acceptance by the majoritarian Christian culture, and opposing it constituted an act of self-assertion and respect. Now, in fact, upon reading Soloveitchik's public opposition to the council, Moshe Sharet, former prime minister and Israel and its first foreign minister, sent Soloveitchik a letter, and he writes, "I wish to express in honor of your Torah my identification with the position you have taken regarding the Vatican and the Catholic Church in your statement," the essence I read in the Israeli papers. And then he writes, "I commend the Jewish pride and political wisdom that your statement reflects." And this issue of pride repeats itself again and again. So Trude Wise Roserman, who is the German-born Jewish intellectual and founding editor of the Jewish Spectator in New York, and one of the fiercest and most vocal opponents of Jewish involvement with the council, just nasty, nasty stuff. She wrote in June of 1965 an article titled "Jewish Honor in the Vatican," where she lashes out against what she calls the Jewish inferiority complex, afflicting American Jewish leadership, and their undignified illness, which she terms the gentilitis addiction, that causes them to delude themselves that they will be accepted as equals by the Gentiles. Now, the third example is one of the quintessential events in which the question of Jewish humiliation and pride comes to the fore is Pope Paul VI's 3-day pilgrimage to the Holy Land in January 1964. Now, he was in Jordan and in Israel, and from the Israeli side, the visit was a political opportunity and a logistical challenge, but it was also perceived as a symbolic encounter between Judaism and Christianity. So procedures, etiquette, statements, gestures received heightened significance, and the appropriate conduct towards the leader of the Catholic world became a matter of public debate. And again, hardly beneath the surface were questions of dignity and pride. Wishing to deny any political interpretation to the visit, Rome decided that Paul would not land in the official Ben Gurion International Airport, or will be officially received and welcomed in Jerusalem, which would imply it recognizes Jerusalem as Israel's state, capital, and the Vatican did not diplomatically recognize Israel at the time at all. But rather he will be received in the small and removed airport in Megiddo, in the north of Israel, which had theological significance but lacked political significance. So Israel faced a dilemma. Should it bite the diplomatic bullet, agree to this condition, which was rooted in the deliberate choice to avoid any formal and symbolic recognition of the state, or should it insist on its national pride, insist on his arrival at Ben Gurion or Jerusalem, and risk sabotaging the visit and alienating the Catholic world? Now, there's a lot of discussion about this, and after a lot of deliberation that included the suggestion that in protest, Israel will not send the president to meet the Pope as per protocol, but rather someone else, the government begrudgingly agreed to Rome's condition. And for many Israelis, the Vatican's demand in itself was seen as this humiliating slight, reflecting the old pattern of Christian reluctance to treat Jews as equal. And by complying, the Israeli government was yielding to this external and humiliating demand and undermining national honor. So it was in Megiddo, ultimately, that the Israeli president Zalman Shazar and other state representatives greeted the Pope in an official ceremony, which was a complicated balancing act between the expectations of of international diplomatic decor and the internal commitment and pressure for Jewish pride. So, for example, it is protocol that the Pope sits slightly higher than anyone around him, and after some internal consultation with the ambassador in Rome, the Israeli ambassador in Rome, the Israel Foreign Office decided that the apparent disrespect towards the Israeli president, by the fact that the Pope's going to be higher than him, could be prevented if the entire ceremony takes place when everyone is standing. So that's what happened. The official honors were conducted with proper eloquence, and Shazar was really seen as embodying the spirit of honor and peace and hospitality. But again, considerations of pride, of religious and national pride, were hardly absent. So just as the Pope avoided using the word Israel in his remarks, which would suggest political connotation, Shazar insisted to use the title Your Highness, when addressing Paul, despite some pressure from the Vatican that he should use the title Your Holiness, because he's not holy to the Jews. In addition, all Orthodox Israeli participants in the ceremony were asked not to wear hats, but rather skull caps, kippot, so that they would proudly flaunt their Jewishness and that their kippot will parallel the Pope's zucchetto. So that was also part of what was going on. I have the archival documents with this demand. Now, it was expected that the chief rabbi of Israel would attend the ceremony as the religious representative of the state. But Rabbi Yitzchak Nissim, the Sephardi chief rabbi, refused to comply, and his justification was, again, appealing to the nexus of pride and humiliation. So he viewed the whole episode as an encounter between Judaism and Christianity. And he said if the Pope is so keen on meeting him, well, the Pope could come meet him at his offices in Jerusalem. Now, Nissim's protests triggered considerable debate, which, again, unfailingly rotated on the question of Jewish pride vis-a-vis Christianity. So for some, his action was an honorable assertion of Jewish self-respect, exhibiting the reclamation of Jewish dignity. So after centuries of weakness and humiliation, Jewish leaders are no longer simply summoned by the Pope, and the chief rabbi of a Jewish state can face Christian leaders as an equal and choose whether or not to meet him. For others, Nissim's refusal was an indecorous and shameful act that humiliated the Pope, the Catholic world, the State of Israel, and Jews all around the globe. And in the Israeli press, Shazar and Nissim, so President Shazar and Chief Rabbi Nissim, emerged as personifications of these two approaches towards religious and national honor. On some occasions, Shazar was lauded as modeling the new era of Jewish sovereignty and self-assertion, and on others, it was Nissim's rebellion that was said to have added honor to the young state's name. And one journalist, Shin Zain Shragai, took a mediating position affirming the actions of both leaders. So he wrote in an article, just as the President of the State of Israel stands in meeting with the Pope added honor, kavod, to the State of Israel and the people of Israel, so the stance of Chief Rabbi Nissim in refusing to meet the Pope added honor to the faith of Israel, the Torah of Israel, and therefore inherently also to the State of Israel and the people of Israel. So this debate displays the emotive economy of pride, shame, humiliation, dignity, and that this was the primary lens through which the Pope's pilgrimage was approached and judged. And it really showcases that how this emotive lens, how the specter of past humiliation and this urge to highlight the new historical reality of the Jews, now possessing dignity and self-assertion and self-respect, how this was not only a frame but also generated practices and affected behavior. So to conclude, Jewish-Christian relations are frequently conceived through theological or intellectual terms, and this is also how Jewish responses to the Second Vatican Council is commonly approached. But as we have seen, emotions play a central role, and appreciating this charged emotive layer, especially as it relates to matters of dignity and shame, can lead to a better understanding of some of the Jewish actions and reactions to this event. But recognizing this emotive legacy also means that it would be wise to pay heed to Spinoza's claim in the Ethics, where he says, an emotion can only be checked or destroyed by a contrary emotion which is stronger than the emotion to be checked. So together with producing carefully worded official documents calling for mutual understanding and dialogue, to arrive at real reconciliation and respect and dialogue, it is equally important to attend to this emotive layer and to cultivate strong, positive emotions between Jews and Christians. And in light of some of the things that we heard yesterday about contemporary difficulties with interfaith dialogue, it seemed that this is also, and perhaps especially, relevant today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for this eye-opening, or shall I say heart-opening presentation, which I think demonstrates nicely just how different their age was from ours, among other things. Let's see, we have time, I'd say, for one question before we move on to Claire. Yes, Sophia.
Thank you for the very interesting presentation. Your description of the visit of the Pope in '64 is certainly in their time. Could you say a couple of words contrasting it with the post-93 recognition reality of a papal visit in our time, or almost our time?
I can try, yes. I'll try to do this quickly. In 1964, the planning of the visit was very abrupt, very quick, and met the Jordanian and Israeli governments in surprise. It was all very, very quick. It was very politically charged, and there was this constant dialectic between the Pope can't just decide he wants to come and now we need to dance to his tune, and this is a huge opportunity and we are going to showcase Israel at its best. This is from the Foreign Office perspective. As a general rule, the Israeli press was, like global press, was really obsessed with the Pope's visit. The Israelis themselves much less so. And there was a big contrast in the media between great excitement in the streets of Jerusalem, Old City Jerusalem, so Jordanian, about seeing the Pope, so much so that they had to change the itinerary because there was almost a stampede that risked the Pope. Okay, so you wanted to go through the entire Via Dolorosa, they had to cut a few stations because it was dangerous because the Jordanians were so excited to see him. And in Israel, it was, by and large, people were indifferent to it. But the press, the official kind of perspective was very celebratory. And I think that was still the case in the 90s, and with Pope John II. Press was very interested, generally Israelis less so. And I also think that in terms of the press, there is still similar voices, in the sense that in what, for lack of a better term, right-wing newspapers basically echo the same critique, against the Pope as in the 1960s. Who cares that he's here? A lot of political stuff. What about, all the history? Like, all these kind of same, I would think there's more parallels that I think sometimes we would like to admit.
Thank you very much. We now move on to our final speaker for this morning, Claire Maligot, who is currently a research fellow at the Fondazione per le Scienze Religiose in Bologna. She defended her doctoral dissertation there in 2024 under the title From Salisbury to Vatican II, ? Rome Confronts Interreligious Relations and the Reform of the Teaching of Contempt, 1947 and 1965. This morning, she will be speaking to us about what happened at the Council outside of Rome, recovering the many-sided Jewish history of Vatican II. The floor is yours.
So, thank you so much for having me. I will begin by quoting one of the most brilliant and unbeknownst to the world that I know, which is my mother. And she's a theologian of the daily life and the small things. And she always says that the word that is the most fragile and overrated is thank you. So this is not just a polite way or a diplomatic way to say that I'm happy to be here, but it's from the bottom of my heart. So thank you so much for having me. And thank you also for the panel. It's great to be there because I began the work with Sara in 2010 in Berlin. And Daniel just happened to be the new friend of the last couple of years, so it's really great to be here. What I will do now is try to give an account of what I am trying to look into as a form of Jewish agency at the Council. As you know, there were no official Jewish observers during the Council because the hypothesis was put on the table but then quickly was rejected in November 1961. But you still had a lot of Jewish reactions and a couple or at least 20 regular Jewish intellectuals of Rome during the council time. So my point is to bring the question that was asked by John O'Malley, the late Jesuit, what happened during Vatican II, by trying to displace a bit that history, leaving Rome and seeing how outside of the church, also outside of Rome, you not only had a Jewish reception of the council, but you also had discussion and involvement that contributed in a way to the council as a Roman Catholic council, ecumenically speaking. The council was understood as ecumenical council in the sense of intra-Christian, but I would say that you have a wider pluralist history of Vatican II through these Jewish contributions. As much as I'm convinced by what I'm saying to you right now, I also want to be really careful with what we're saying, in the sense that I don't think that Nostra Aetate has been a text written with non-Christians, written with Jews, with Muslims. It has been a text written about Jews, about Muslims, but it's a peculiar text within the history of Vatican II for one peculiar reason, that is, it has been written under the eyes of others, and this has changed so much in the way we are understanding theology and the theology of the Council. So, in order to do that, I will basically come back to 3 points. The first one is to insist first on the discrepancies that we have between Jewish agendas and Catholic agenda at the Council. My second point will be to look into what French sociology called repertory of actions, so basically the means that you have to act. So I will look into the various repertories of actions that were brought by Jewish actors at Vatican II under an overarching stake that was the fight against anti-Semitism. And I will try to show you how within that big frame you had then a couple of new issues that raised up. And the last theme will be what happened behind closed doors. And I'm here quoting Karma, what you were writing about the other history of interfaith dialogue, interfaith relations, that is internal history of the exchanges. And I will try to try, it's a superficial way, but I will try to do that on the many Jewish sides, and here using the plural terms. So let's start with discrepancies. I will first, and building on what Danielle was just saying, building on the idea that we have to get, we had to get rid of big names in the history of Vatican II, because often we are looking at big individuals, but archival work show you how much more complicated it is. So I will take the one symbol that we're using for Vatican II, which is the audience of the French historian Jules Isaac, received by the Pope. It is always presented in continuation, and this is something important in connection with the audience that he had first with Pius XII, so the new Pope. In June of 1960, he was dissatisfied with his previous audience of 49, and he was received by the new Pope in order to try to obtain the condemnation of anti-Semitism that the Seligsburg movement couldn't, and the International Council for Christian and Jews couldn't get from Pius XII. So you have that narrative of an old French individual historian going to the Vatican to get that pontifical condemnation that is one of the many roots of the Jewish then decree, or so-called Jewish decree at the Vatican. What is important to me is that it wasn't alone at all. It was actually supported by a small center based in Paris that was fighting against anti-Semitism, so it was a documentation center as much as an advocacy center, and the center was subsidized by the B'nai Brit. So in order to get approval for, and also the logistical means to get to Rome, you had to have a credit line, and so you have discussion within B'nai Brit, both at the European level and also at the level of the Executive International Council based in Washington. And you see here various positions. Ehrlich wasn't that happy to have Isaac in Rome, because he was saying that he was too much of a positivist historian in his way of handling the scriptures, and that would never pass for Catholic theologians, Catholic exegetes. So the Ehrlich vision was against the French Parisian vision, and at the same time you had in Washington the board who collegially decided out of efficiency first not to subsidize such a trip because it was too expensive in regard with the outcome in terms of potential influence before changing opinions. So what I want to show you is that actually when you have one entry of an audience in the Vatican archives, you have so many month-long preparation to have that kind of interaction. So the other point that I want to show is to say that on the Catholic side in Rome, Jules Isaac wasn't that well received, in the sense that Bea, when he is implementing first the subcommission for on the Jews, would say that he has actually read Jules Isaacs' memorandum, but he disagrees with the thesis of Christian roots of anti-Semitism, and he wants the church to address the issue by taking the counterposition. So this is, again, to show you how you have one text, but the agendas from the beginning on are different. And Bea's reading of the issue is still very much influenced by the former way of looking, so former for us, but the usual way of looking at anti-Semitism, which is Pius XI's allocution, saying that because we are spiritually Semites, then Christianism can't be anti-Semite, and so anti-Semitism is a personal fault. But you have nothing at a structural level, and Bea is really in that reading, and he's also in that reading because he's an exegete, and so his way of understanding exegesis at the time is to say that he doesn't want to change the theology at all. What he wants is a better understanding of the scripture, a more correct way. And that notion of being correct, being right, is the pre-Vatican II theology of truth. The idea that the church is the only one to have the truth, and so exegesis should be better at expressing that truth. And in order to do that, you could use biblical exegesis, historical exegesis in the limited way of the Biblical Pontifical Institute, which had, and we're in Jerusalem, which had some difficulties with the French way of doing things in the EBAF, in the École Biblique. So you have a completely different discussion on the Catholic side about this. So my last point on this would be to say that when we look at Vatican II, we have theological temporalities that are so different on so many different levels, but I would really stand again the importance of the document that was published by the Holy Office and then advertised even in a confidential way to all bishops, saying that religious indifferentism was the barrier that Roman and also all clergy, local clergy, not just Rome, but really the local clergy, had put in front of the beginning of interfaith exchanges. However, under that circumstances, you needed to have brokers on both sides to explain Catholic theology to Jews on the one side, and also Jewish views to Catholic theologians. So the issue of Vatican II is to find the brokers. In order to write a memorandum, Jewish organizations had circulated the memorandum and went to James Parks, so an Anglican father, an Anglican priest. He was a scholar on anti-Semitism and on Christian anti-Semitism, and in the archives, in the correspondence, is making a joke of being the court Jew of Jewish organizations, trying to put the philosophical, theological line behind the memorandum understandable to Catholic eyes. So this is to show on the one side that you had that ecumenical mediation here, understood at Anglican Catholic, and on the other side you had to find Jewish scholars that would know of Catholic theology. That was the case of Ehrlich on the one side for sure, of Werblowski also here in Jerusalem, and I think to a certain extent the way that Heschel was more read in Catholic circles than it was at the time to Jewish circles, but you had to find new ways of understanding one another in the sense of making your point and getting your point heard. So moving to the many agendas behind the fight against anti-Semitism. Again, I think that long-term temporalities, long-term timelines matter, and so many, and that's why sometimes I'm not that happy with the idea of a rupture with Vatican II. Many of the Jewish interlocutors, dialogue partners of the Vatican at the time of Vatican II had actually a long-standing experience of negotiations with the Vatican. They had been among the first to meet with Pope Pius XII after the Holocaust. So you can't completely separate pontificates on so many levels, in the sense that the Pope dies, but the Church remains, and the Roman Curia remains. So Delacroix was still there, Montini was still there. I see an evolution of Delacroix in the 50s to the 60s for sure. I don't see any evolution of Montini on the Jewish question from just in the immediate post-war era up to Vatican II. I think that he is theologically consistent with himself, and he is also diplomatically consistent and rather distant, far more distant with his Jewish visitors in the Vatican than the previous Pope John the 23rd was. So negotiations implied a form of experience. It's also something that was built in the diaspora, especially not in Europe, but in the United States. And I will insist here on the role of liberal Judaism, and especially the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. It was not just part of the outreach of the UAHC, but also part of their program of outreach that they had built in the 50s on. And so they're basically using this grassroots experience at a local level to transform that into national guidelines, federal guidelines within the United States. And they're bringing that expertise then to Rome also through secular organizations, because you had many of these liberal rabbis who served on interfaith committees within secular Jewish agencies. So my point is to insist on, the transition from one theology changing into another, but also from the experience that was built up in the two previous decades. Rabbinical organizations had to deal with the fact, because they were not that happy at the beginning, that it was mostly Jewish defense agencies that first took up the idea to go to Rome. And here I would like to make again some differences, some distinctions, because I do think that space matter. So for example, Argentinian and Brazilian chief rabbis went to Rome, as well as the Rabbi of Madrid, because in these specific cases, coming to Rome was a way to bypass difficult relations with either national governments. In the Argentinian case, it's the Taquara movement that is leading the moment or influencing the Argentinian politics. But you also have difficult relations with the Spanish church. So going to Rome and trying to promote, relations at the overarching level, hierarchically, of the Catholic Church is a way to try to secure better relations at the local level. And building on that, also about European organizations, the European Council of the Council of European Rabbis, decided to follow on Soloveitchik advice, not to go to Rome and not to send any observer. Toaf, so the chief rabbi of Rome, had to abide by the collective decision, even though he wanted, on his part, as the chief rabbi of Rome, to have some discussion with the Vatican. So my point is to say that I have just taken a few names and a few spots, but you have transnational discussion that are happening about Vatican II in the Jewish world. And my point is not to say that Vatican II was a truly global council because it was able to have a non-Christian outreach, which is the way of so many optimistic, also open-minded, not conservative theologians such as Congar would see the council at the time. But it's to say that you have a pluralistic history of Vatican II with a Jewish side that is often not looked at by Catholic scholars when they deal with Vatican II. Beyond just advocacy and human rights advocacy, I want also to insist on the role of scholarship and the way scholarship and academic work was brought by other Jewish, that at this time intellectual and scholars, when they try to look at the day-side issue, not through the lens only of anti-Semitism, but from the sources, Roman law sources, Jewish law sources, in order to try to deconstruct the day-side charge, but in a way that would address the sources in a scientific way. And this is also a really American way of understanding interfaith relations in the 40s and 50s, based on the notion of bias, and the way you want to address that bias also at a psychological and a rational level. And the way to do that was to bring in psychology as well as to bring in scientific proof. And that transformation, for me, is not, again, something linked with Vatican II, but it's something that happened far before, from the late 30s on. So, moving to the last part, what happened behind a closed door? I'm going to go really quickly about that. So the first idea is that you have an evolution within Jewish organizations, secular organizations, defaced agencies, as well as rabbinical organizations, on the way to address Christians. And again, it goes from political affairs to interfaith or interreligious affairs. So you have a rebranding, except for the American Jewish Committee and the UAHC. see. We had done that before, but the early 60s, is a moment in which the way of naming exchanges are changing. The way you choose the staff is also changing, because when Tenenbaum is leaving the Synagogue Council of America for the American Jewish Committee, where he will take the position of Israel Katzer, he has to find a replacement as the executive of the American Jewish Committee. And among the curriculums, the CVs that the Synagogue Council of America is receiving, the people that are seen as the best candidates are the one with Christian experience, so experience of discussions with Christians, either Protestant or Catholic. I will skip the halakhic lines on participation. What I would like to insist on really quickly is that we have just spoken about Soloveitchik. I think that the evolution of his position from November 1960 up to the confrontation article is also to be linked with that dynamic of confidential exchanges and public opinion. He has a consistent point of view that he has expressed so many times in confidential correspondence with the World Jewish Congress, with the ADL, with the European Council of Rabbis, but he goes public when he decides that it's too much. And so you have first his position within the Rabbinical Council of America, and then the publication of his article. However, there was a cost. There was a cost for Jewish defense agencies to be upfront about dialogue. So the Public Relations Committee are often comparing membership and the diminution of membership with outreach to Rome, because the issue is Jewish indifference and how the American Jewish Committee is perceived by its own community. So we are putting up front a couple of names. We are putting up front a couple of Jewish intellectuals, but we have to remember that the majority of the people, of the Jewish public opinion, was not that interested by dialogue. It was interested by the end of the Deicide charge. However, I do see local implementations that are produced by that moment, not by the event, by the moment of the council, and that would be all the programs that have risen up in the mid 60s. I will just quote those of the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. For example, the beginning of hosting tours of synagogues for Christians, the beginning of shared seder with Christians, and at the same time, on the Catholic side, many bishops were still reluctant. If you take the example of the Cincinnati Archbishop, in December 1965, so the declaration has been promulgated, he still relies on the document of the Holy Office that states that you had to be experienced and you had to get the approval of the bishop in order to go, to prevent a group of Catholic students with their chaplain to assist to an interfaith meeting with the rabbi and the Jewish group of the nearby university. So my point is to show you that we're speaking of transition in terms of exchanges, of repertories of actions, but in the minds and in the practice, you have the text, and then you have what you want to do with it, and it has taken much longer. So thank you so much.
So Claire, to quote your mother, thank you. Truly for a very important perspective on the whole question. We have 27 minutes for discussion. the floor is open. Discussion, questions, comments? Questions are better than comments, but we'll take comments too. Yes? Nina.
I have a question when you mentioned the audience with Montini and Heschel. And I was wondering if you know more about what triggered the disaster, if it was coming from the side of Heschel or from Montini and from Paul VI. I'm saying that because, I think Montini remained positioned toward Jews, still remains clear somehow in the scholarship, and new archives show evidence of anti-Semitic comments from Montini when he was in the church. So I was wondering if you can tell us a bit more from that audience until the archives of Paul VI open, but that would be with the gate. So
Yes, happily. First of all, I think we could talk about, I'm writing about the Jewish attitude towards Paul VI during the council, which is also, I think, interesting. The audience was arranged by Jewish and American Catholic pressure, because there was, right beforehand, there was an additional watering down of the document on the Jews. There was insertion of the hope for Jewish conversion, and it was there were rumors about whether or not the deicide accusation was going to be in or out. From the Jewish side and from the American Catholic side, this was seen as a crisis, and they tried to arrange an audience with the Pope. The Vatican did not want this audience at all. It did not want the image of the Pope meeting with Jews and then the documents changing, that would be perceived as external influence. And also, the session began that very day. So first, the Vatican had a protocol that you do not have private audiences with the Pope while the session is taking place, to avoid the veneer of external influence, and also because the Pope is just very, very busy. They did not want it, but there was enough pressure for them for Rome to say okay, with the criteria that it is kept secret completely. And then there was a mistake. They organized the Pope for Shabbat, and Heschel couldn't do it. And this is where, like, Jewish myth making, this is the stuff of Jewish myth making. He went to Rome and it was Shabbat and it changed, and all that was like how it was. This audience was told. But the thing was, Heschel just panicked. That was just it. He was very nervous and he panicked. And it was also pretty clear from the very beginning that Paul was not enthusiastic about the recurrence of the. He was coming in and out of meetings. It was the first or second day of the session, and that he was going to remain unmoved to Heschel's arguments. Schuster, in his report, he wrote a few reports about this audience, said that in addition to Heschel's kind of panic, that the pling itself wasn't, like the arguments themselves weren't very convincing. Now, whether or not this is Schuster trying to justify his move, which is pretty, unconventional, to interrupt a council, an audience with a pope and shift to a language, that's pretty drastic. But he said that that Heschel's arguments weren't very good either. So what it was just an unfortunate moment where, not everyone is equipped to deal with those kind of pressure situations. Heschel did a good job some of the time, and here he didn't. What's interesting is that it took 2 years until more details about the audience came out. A few months after the audience happened, it came out to the media. I have suspicions who leaked the information. But the information about the audience was very positive about Heschel. That's all I'm going to say.
Before moving on to the next question, just a quick question that you can answer in one word. What language were they speaking before they shifted to French?
I think it was, that's a good question, I think it was English. English, right? Yeah.
Just to add on that, a couple of days before, Arthur Goldberg, the Supreme Chief of Justice in the United States, is received by Montini, so by the Pope, and he is bringing up his negotiation skills, and he's addressing Montini as Monsignor Labor, because he used to have a good relation with workers when he was the Archbishop of Milan. And so this kind of repertory of action falls totally through, and that's the wife of Goldberg, who tells the history of the audience to his son in the letter that she is sending to him, and speaking about the excitement of being received by the Pope. So I think that Heschel came right after, because it was the last hope of the American Jewish community at the time to try to divert the direction.
So we have questions from Zvi and then Bishop Griffin.
This is also for Daniel. I just wonder whether you could maybe reflect on the relationship between this discourse of pride and dignity that's happening in this context and the broader kind of discourse about Jewish pride, or I'm thinking in particular around, say, the Heschel Salvation division within American denominations, and the kind of emergence of an Orthodox discourse of pride, Norman Lamb, I guess perhaps a little bit later, but also salvation itself, and so the idea of public Judaism, prideful Judaism that is figuring in Orthodox, an emergent Orthodox self-presentation.
Yeah, excellent question. Here, I'll first of all, I'll echo Claire's point about there has been emphasis on specific individuals in the scholarship on Jewish involvement in Vatican II, which is a skewed account, because it was Heschel and Soloveitchik played specific roles, contained roles in this broader effort. It's also, I will also say that the common presentation of both of them as representing opposing and different views with regards to interfaith dialogue is also not entirely accurate, and reflects later American Jewish identity clashes between students of Soloveitchik and students of Heschel. Heschel and Soloveitchik worked together for just about 2 years with the AJC with regard to the Vatican. They had their different positions, but Heschel and Soloveitchik were relatively very involved until a certain point where Soloveitchik said no more, and then publicly attacked Jewish involvement and attacked Heschel. For Soloveitchik, what's interesting is that when he talks about Judaism and Jewish interfaith dialogue with Jews and Jewish pride and dignity, he is thinking about orthodoxy. And I just wrote about this word. This very same arguments he makes about why you should not engage with Christians are the very arguments he says about why you should not engage with Reform or conservative Judaism. And it's a matter of authenticity, pride, and the private nature of religion. So there's this celebration of public prayer in the United States, and the Jews get very involved, and the Jewish denominations want to have a pan-Jewish prayer day. And the Soloveitchik are like, will Orthodoxy be involved, or will Orthodoxy enter Reformed temples? And the answer is no, of course not, because one does not engage with, he's not going to say non-Jewish, but he's going to say insufficiently, or right, the wrong kind, or the inauthentic kind. So that is very much part of it. So it's a question of Jewish pride that is directed externally and internally for Soloveitchik.
got a question from the woman in the window seat in the back.
Thank you for this review. I thought it was fascinating. I have a question still in the same the economy of emotions. I really like this perspective. And I was wondering if the reason why this economy of emotion is around dignity and pride or humiliation is because one characteristic that is very salient in anti-Semitism is humiliation. And do you think that the source of this whole economy of emotion until today that we have comes from these specific characteristics and is strongly present in anti-Semitism? And if yes, maybe why do you think that's the origin of it?
Yes, I think that from the Jewish perspective, it is very much rooted in this historical memory of subjugation and humiliation. I should also note that there is an element of like humiliation from the Christian side towards Judaism, like that. We see this in more ancient, past historical sources where the very existence of Judaism is kind of a discomfort in the sense that it represents the fact that the world has not fully, the Jews have not recognized Christ yet. But yes, it draws on these historical memories, and the 1960s constitutes a very interesting place with regards to Jewish self-identity. So Jews feel relatively comfortable in the United States, and Jews have a sovereign state in Israel. So it's two different forms of Jewish pride and dignity and self-dignity, but still Jews thinking of themselves in these terms. And then there is this council that is precisely negotiating between visions of Jews of the past and the contemporary world. And that is where Jews are doing the same kind of zigzag between past emotions and present emotions in their response to it. So yes, I think that's exactly right.
Bishop Lafitte?
A short reflection and perhaps a kind of reflection question. It was, first of all, really thank you very much. It was very, very interesting. But I felt that there were two approaches, one more pessimistic, one more optimistic. And it was very interesting to hear about the emotions, dignity, humiliation, because I think it's a very important factor. So when we talk about the difficulties to progress with Vatican II, how can we progress? I mean, if we, how to tell it? It was very interesting to hear you, but my question is, what is the next step? What should we do today? Nostra Aetate, as you said today, is not the same as 60 years ago. Today, the rise of anti-Semitism, in my opinion, depends much more on woke theory than on Christian anti-Judaism. It's something else. It's about justice, how people understand justice in the world, and is Israel what is doing? It's like a supremacy or something like this. So we are against supremacists. Many youth in the world are reacting to Israel. There is anti-Semitism for such reasons, I think, rather than for anti-Judaism. Nobody knows about anti-Judaism among the youth who are against Israel. So what is the next step? Sorry, it's a bit confused, but in my head I'm trying to clarify it.
Yeah, I'll just add that I think this is a question to Daniel and to Sara. It's very relevant to Sara's paper as well.
Okay, thank you very much for your question and bringing then all the papers on this panel together. I think it's an important question. First of all, maybe it's a different hermeneutical start on looking up to Nostra Aetate. For me, it's not a changing document. For me, it's a document of the Vatican Council with its true legitimacy for all its members and as a Catholic woman. For me, it's a seeing church with all with the Holy Mary and all the people are not there anymore, and today. So maybe this is I'm reading Nostra Aetate as a Catholic document with a value. And so not changing, but I think there is something in, and of course it's a process, and of course the people who were discussing and writing and fighting for it, and there were lots of fathers who were fighting for that the document comes on the table, for sure. But, so I can only speak for the from the German perspective, and we have a kind of similar what you described on anti-Semitism coming from, let's call it the left side, the woke side. I'm not using this description, but anyhow. I think the interesting thing is to see how church, bishops, priests, educator in religious, in curricula, when you look at how you can study Catholic theology, there's no seminar on contemporary Judaism. And we have 2 papers coming up after Nostra Aetate, how to deal with Nostra Aetate in schooling and in education and in university. We have now 60 years later in German university. It is always on the engagement of the professor. So if the professor says his hermeneutical thinking of his Catholicism is involved with Judaism and with from Nostra Aetate, then you will find contemporary Judaism, you will find the Disputation. But if it's not, you can study Catholic theology with, having the Old Testament, as we say, and having, so what we should do now, for me, it would be to be, how do you say in German, in English, glaubwürdig.
Credibility.
Incredible. Incredible what is written in Nostra Aetate, and to take it on account. And it means for the German side, not to say that's one case, and when a bishop says something about the bounds with Israel and that the church is although higher than it or kind of better than it, that everyone just looked at it and said, okay, it's a misunderstanding. No, it isn't. It has a tradition over hundreds of years, and it has meaning for the people sitting there and listening it. In the same time, what we have now in Germany, with all the demonstrations and all the hatreds and all the secular anti-Semitism, it's all again on the streets. It's a kind of getting together, like enemies are getting friends. So I think we need to be really clear on what we mean when we say theological, and maybe that's another point for me to bring here. I'm not talking about interfaith dialogue. The dialogue between Jewish and Christian is not interfaith from the Christian perspective. It's the inner. So you're not sure?
No,
But when you see, maybe to make but maybe to make it clear, that's why I citated the Mysterium Ecclesiae on the first chapter. It's the start. It's maybe to make this clear as well. For me, Nostra Aetate, chapter 4, Mysterium Ecclesiae, is not a chapter about Judaism or Jews. It's about the church itself. So then, maybe makes it a bit clearer what I want from my church, from Mother Church.
Daniel, do you want to add to that? Yeah.
Question to Sara. Thank you for all of the papers. I wasn't entirely clear about the definitions of anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism operating. And I think I understood you to be saying that structurally anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism were not addressed at all in Nostra Aetate. Is that?
No.
You weren't saying that?
No.
Ah.
No, but should I? No, or you
So
go, yeah.
okay, so maybe my question was going to say, what, picking up from the bishop's question, what would be a 10-word document? What would be the lines of a 10-word authoritative document that would get rid of anti-Judaism, as I understand you to be saying is the issue? Because I'm not quite sure what it is that needs to be addressed there in terms of your discussion.
Mm-hmm. So no, I think that Nostra Aetate did the document is the grammar of the new Israel theology.
Mm-hmm.
So it addresses anti-Judaism and also on the fifth paragraph, the anti-Semitism, all discrimination to everyone, and also anti-Semitism. And also we already have the sentence that anti-Semitism is a sin from 1928 already. But what I wanted to say is, so having this document now, and how do you say, overcovering the discussion and the fights during the council, and saying then that anti-Semitism was on the margins, has a momentum in it, what helps, and then going a bit years before in Germany, for the German churches, to present themselves as the second victims of the Nazi period, to present themselves as the power of, or the only power of democracy. So politicians couldn't go without the church. Saying in the same time that the church has no engagement with anti-Semitism. Maybe we have religiously anti-Semitism. That's a religious talk. That's not murdering, right? Getting up all the teams. So, but it having this document has it all in, but we need to formulate it. But what happened, or not everywhere, but my question is, why don't we have it so strongly in our tradition? Let's make a different example with the songbooks in Germany. They are revised in 2018, I think, something around. You see still a line of anti-Judaism in it. So, and when you say you want to combat and you give the promise, why is it not in the curricula for every student of Catholic theology? Why not? So I think in Nostra Aetate it is. So I wouldn't say it's not in there, but how the reception of Nostra Aetate has also, this is what I want to say, it's not only a success story, it has also a momentum and what is used. You can always say we did. We rejected theological anti-Judaism. But when you look at the textbooks for the kids in the German schools, and you need in Germany to produce the textbooks on religious, you need the mission of the church, and you have still pages on it where, yeah, I can't put it now in English words, but you have like life kickers of Jesus' death, or founding paper of the silence and secret coming together of the Jews, and or you have the question of would you behave like Judas when your best friend were Jesus? I mean, there's kids from 7 years.
So it sounds like the 400-year process that you were talking about yesterday. So I was looking for ways to speed it up. Eric, you had a question?
Yeah. Sara, it's for you. It's good to see you in a different context than we saw each other last time. Are you a historian and a sociologist? Is that correct to say?
So I was trained in French university, so secular approach to history. Then I moved to Germany and I discovered, let's say, Catholic theology in Freie Universitätsbildung, which is secular university. And then because of plagiarism, I had to so I wasn't the guilty one. Let's have it put on the table too. I had to move and change university, so I finally defended my PhD in Bologna, so the historical center for the history of Vatican II, which is directed by Alberto Meloni.
Okay, so actually that wasn't my question, but
Yes.
I'm glad you imagine your research is brilliant, and I was very enriched by the whole presentation. I have all these notes that I took right hand.
In the sense that so secularly trained and interested in theology, because as historian dealing with church papers, I need to understand the theology in it, and it took me a long time.
So that is exactly the question that I had for you now that I'll ask you. We have 30 seconds remaining. So he was inspired by what Bishop Rafik just said. He was saying, if I understood correctly, that really the wokeism or the left-wing anti-Semitism based on power dynamics is much more relevant now, and Christian anti-Judaism maybe not so relevant, to which I would say, would that it were so simple. I come from the Western world, right, and in the English-speaking world also. Christian anti-Judaism is certainly more relevant now than ever since I was born, and I'm almost 50, my God, right? So here in your presentation, underneath in red, you said something that's a theological reflection, right? And I thought this lady is a historian with some theological interests, but she doesn't understand maybe the resonance of this phrase.
Okay,
this is the phrase, the pre-Vatican II theology of truth. Okay?
Yes.
So this is what Pearl Ratzinger, who became the Pope and then stopped being the Pope, would have called a hermeneutic of rupture, right?
Yes.
So I'm very concerned, because I have lots of friends on all kinds of spectrums, with getting rid of the resurgence of anti-Judaism and let's call it very conservative forms of Christianity, Catholicism. This hermeneutic does not do my job, doesn't help me at all. So that's not your job to do my job. What do you mean when you say a pre-Vatican II, it's not just the conception of like the Latin Mass or something, but a theology of truth that's very ambitious.
I would go back to the book of Karin Schelkens, worked on the preparatory documents from the Theological Commission at Vatican II. And I think that, so to me, this is transition, and so theology is transitioning into something else with Nostra Aetate, but the maturation, the labor to give birth to the document is really difficult, and what you have in the middle of that is the neo-scholastic approach to truth. And so for Nostra Aetate to happen, you have a complete change from the first draft for the Schema on the Church, and then the Lumen Gentium, because what you have is within the preparatory phase, you have something about non-Christians that are not recognizing God, and you have that equation between knowledge of God and then recognition of God. And this is the scholastic approach, I think, to truth. And what you have in the end is Lumen Gentium 16 and Nostra Aetate about what is good in others. So you have that anthropological turn, theologically speaking, that takes the human being as the base. And so I am really cautious about Buber being received within the Catholic Church. I think that why Heschel was called by the Vatican a theologian, it was because he was in that interrelational approach and mediation between the human being and God and the other, and it's something that is totally strange to Catholic theology at the time. And so you need the 4 years of the Council to shift the grounds in order for the problem to become theological and not just exegetical revision. Bea is the one working on the Roman Breviary revision as much as the Holy Week liturgy revision in the 50s. So when you received Isaac, it's just saying, well, you know, we are going to address that as we have done in the 50s. That's the point at the beginning. In order to bring in the theology, you need the work of the Council to happen at the same time. Nostra Aetate is not just what happened in Rome and what happened outside of it, it's also what happened in Nostra Aetate and other documents. And I think that we have echoes all over the place.
We'll have to have a talk.
So, Daniel began by expressing the hope that today would meet and pass yesterday's bar. I think we can all agree that it has. Thank you very much to the three of you for your